Many terrible creatures and beings walked the face of Middle-earth. Some of these were followers of Sauron, while others were evil entities of a more ancient time. The Nazgul were among the former, and they were by far the greatest of Sauron's servants. Their Morgul Blades were deadly with the slightest of cuts, and the Nazgul were surrounded by a terrible aura of fear and dread, which drove men mad, and few could stand before them. It must have been terrible to face them in battle, for the odds of beating them must have seemed almost impossible. Yet they did have certain vulnerabilities that could be exploited to weaken them significantly. In today's episode, we'll be exploring these weaknesses as the ultimate guide to surviving an ordeal with the Nazgul. So the Nazgul's greatest strength lay in their aura, which allowed their mere presence to consume the minds of their enemies with terror. They would leave most men cowering in fear, unable to fight back. And this aura of dread grew more powerful once the Nazgul were given their new mounts, the Fell Beasts, whose cries terrified the free people. Tolkien compared this unreasoning fear to that of ghosts, and even though it was a dreadful thing to face, it was still possible to resist it. Some of the most courageous and fearless warriors were able to overcome it, and by doing so, they would be able to stand their ground against the Ringwraiths, since it was this aura that made the Nazgul so powerful, rather than any significant fighting ability. Now, according to the lore of Arda, there were two planes of existence, the spiritual world and the physical world, and the Ringwraiths' forms existed in the spiritual one, which is why they were invisible. It seems that their existence in the spiritual plane was linked with their dreadful aura, for we are told that other beings that had once lived in the Undying Lands, such as Galadriel, Glorfindel, and the Five Wizards, were very resistant to the fear of the Nazgul, for these people lived simultaneously in the spiritual and physical planes. I'd also like to quickly mention that the Nazgul were stronger when they acted together, so avoiding them as a group or trying to separate them could prove to be a vital strategy to your survival. Now, at times, this aura of fear would actually hinder the Nazgul's plans, for they weren't able to turn off this ability, which made it extremely hard for them to conduct any missions of stealth and secrecy without their presence being felt by other living beings. This would force them to rely on servants and spies to gather information, and the Nazgul would use black robes to help them when they had to deal with the living, for these robes gave shape to their nothingness, and they helped to diminish their dreadful aura. If the Nazgul had to lose their robes or their mounts, they would be forced to travel all the way back to Mordor for new ones, and this would prove to be a weakness in itself that made them much less efficient. Sunlight was also known to weaken the Nazgul's aura of dread, and it seemed to suppress and stifle all of their powers and abilities. The sunlight would confuse all of the Nazgul apart from the Witch King, making them stray from their path, and this made it much harder for them to track their foes during the day. We also know that the Nazgul's vision was different from that of living beings, for they were unable to see a world of light, and they instead saw a grey world that was filled with the shadows and dark shapes of other creatures. These shadows were destroyed in the noon sun, and this rendered the Nazgul blind to the presence of their prey. Some of the elements, such as water and fire, could also be used to scare off the Nazgul or to keep them at bay. Their fear of water is particularly interesting, because all of the Nazgul, apart from the Witch King, were reluctant to cross streams and rivers, unless they were very desperate, and the hobbits would use this to their advantage when they escaped from the Nazgul by crossing the Brandywine River, or after their arrival in Rivendell. It seems that water would also block their senses, acting as a barrier of sorts, for we're told that the Nazgul couldn't sense the movement of the One Ring after it had crossed the Brandywine River. We're never told why water was so particularly effective against the Nazgul, and so the best we can do is speculate. Our first theory is that the waters of Middle-earth were somewhat sacred, since the spirit of the Valar, called Ulmo, was said to run through them, and this might have kept the evil of the Nazgul at bay. We're told that for all seas, lakes, rivers, fountains, and springs are in his government, so that the elves say that the spirit of Ulmo runs in all the veins of the world. The other theory is based on Morgoth's essence in Arda, for when Morgoth corrupted the world, he spread his power and influence throughout its various elements and aspects, and we know that out of all of Arda's being, water contained the least amount of his corruption, and so it was one of the purest things that remained. Perhaps it was this lack of evil that acted as a barrier to the Nazgul's powers and movement. So as we mentioned earlier, water wasn't the only element that the Nazgul were wary of, for fire was also a great fear of theirs. It could be used to keep them at bay, or even to scare them off, and for some reason it seems that fire also helped to counteract or resist some of the Nazgul's magic and evil. For example, after Frodo was stabbed by a Morgul blade upon Weathertop, he started to slowly shift into the Wraith world as the sword's evil magic consumed him. However, he was able to hinder some of these symptoms and slow down the process of this transition by lying next to fire. Speaking of fire, I'd like to point out another weakness of the Witch King, which is never confirmed to be shared with the rest of the Nazgul. So after the Witch King established the realm of Angmar, we learn that he was able to use his magic to cast spells of ice. He could create frost or make it melt at his will, and he could conjure great storms of wind and snow to roar out of Angmar. This magic of his was stronger during the winter months, for his power waned in summer. Now it's possible that this weakness was due to the change in climate, since the winter season would have provided the ideal conditions to amplify his frost magic. So if the Free People had to stage an attack upon the Witch King's realm of Angmar, a summer attack could prove advantageous. During the Witch King's campaign against Arnor, the Dunedain men of those lands forged special blades that were infused with spells that made them deadly to the servants of Mordor. These spells were quite effective against the Nazgul, for we see how Merry was able to use one of these weapons to stab the Witch King, and its magic allowed Éowyn to deal the killing blow. I believe that its magic helped to anchor the Witch King's being to the physical world out of the spiritual one, which would explain his sudden vulnerability. Another weakness of the Ringwraiths was their connection to Sauron, for their power was directly linked with his, and so they were always limited by their master's own strength. After Sauron's first defeat, they were forced to go into hiding, as shadows of their former selves, having to wait until Sauron partially recovered before they could be active once more. It's probably no coincidence that the Nazgul would finally meet their demise following the ring's destruction, when they were caught in Mount Doom's eruption and destroyed forever. On a similar note, we know that the Nazgul grew weaker as they travelled further away from the land of Mordor, which made them less effective in distant lands. There is one other point that I'd like to quickly mention, though I'm not sure if calling it a weakness is appropriate. It seems that crying out the name of Elbereth, the Valar of the Stars, could intimidate the Nazgul. They associated her name with the High Elves, and so perhaps the Nazgul would think that their foe was connected with these powerful beings, and that they shouldn't underestimate their enemy. So I hope you all enjoyed today's video, and that you learned something new. Can you think of any other weaknesses of the Nazgul that I might have missed? And what strategy would you use to overcome them? As always, we'd like to give a quick shout out to all of the patrons that choose to support this channel. Your help makes this channel possible, and your support is deeply appreciated, particularly the Valar-Tier Patrons, Jacob Williams, Michael Angel and T. Gorman, and the Wizard-Tier Patrons, James Stodgel, Andrew Burma, Mike Feeney and Roland Meervold. If you also would like to help and support this channel while unlocking some cool perks, we'll be leaving a link to the Patreon page in the video description. You could also support this channel by checking out our store, and by following us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter, and joining our Discord server. All of these links can be found in the video description. Don't forget to leave a like if you enjoyed this video, and subscribe to join our fellowship today. Until next time, when we'll once again explore the magical world and lore of Middle-earth.